What does an emperor do when he murders the woman he obsesses over? When he kicks his pregnant wife, Poppaea Sabina, to death in a fit of rage, and is then left with a silence that echoes louder than any screaming. If you are the Roman Emperor Nero, you do not simply mourn. You do not repent. You reconstruct. The scene is one of the most grotesque and psychologically baffling in Roman history. It is not a secret affair, hidden in the shadowed halls of the palace. It is a public ritual, a state-sanctioned hallucination performed for the entire world to see. The Emperor Nero is getting married. His bride is a young boy, a former slave named Sporus. The boy is beautiful, eerily so, because before this day, Nero's surgeons were ordered to castrate him, to sculpt his flesh and mold his identity into a perfect, living echo of the dead Empress Poppaea. Dressed in the lavish gowns of an empress, veiled and adorned with the imperial jewels, Sporus is paraded through the streets of Rome. The Praetorian Guard salutes him. The court refers to him not as Sporus, but as Empress, or even Poppaea. Nero, the grieving husband, has found a way to cancel his crime. He has not resurrected his dead wife. He has created a ghost made of flesh, a walking monument to his own guilt and his absolute power to warp reality. Was this the act of a madman? A mind so broken by parricide, paranoia, and unchecked power that it had finally shattered? Or was it something far more chilling? A calculated performance? The ultimate declaration of a ruler so omnipotent that he could not only defy law and tradition, but could defy nature itself. Publicly marrying a man, forcing his court to accept a boy as an empress, and commanding them to see a dead woman in the eyes of a living slave. To understand this theater of the depraved, to truly grasp how the ruler of the known world arrived at this moment, we cannot simply list his atrocities. We must perform a psychological autopsy. We must travel back to the very beginning, to the poisoned nursery of a boy born into a dynasty of monsters, and examine a soul that was suffocated from birth by the ambitions of a ruthless mother. This is not just a history of Nero's crimes. This is the origin story of how a human being becomes a god in his own mind and a demon to the rest of the world. Before Nero became a monster, he was a boy, and to understand the monster one must first understand the cage that shaped the boy. His first cage was his own bloodline. The Julio-Claudian dynasty was not merely a royal family. It was a cocktail of divine ambition and homicidal madness, a lineage that produced the strategic genius of Augustus alongside the deranged cruelty of Caligula. Nero was born into this genetic storm, the great-grandson of the god-emperor Augustus, but also the nephew of the emperor who famously tried to make his horse a consul. Violence and vanity were his birthright. His childhood, however, would ensure that the worst aspects of this inheritance would flourish. His early years were not spent in the gilded halls of power, but in the shadow of exile. His father died when he was a toddler, a man known for being cruel and unremarkable. His mother, the formidable Agrippina the Younger, was banished by her own brother Caligula, leaving the young Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the boy who would become Nero, to be raised by an aunt. He was an afterthought, a discarded pawn in a game he was too young to understand. This abandonment forged the first hollow space in his soul, a deep, gnawing need for love, for attention, for adoration. It was a void that once he became emperor, he would try to fill with the applause of the entire world, and when that failed, with its terror. He was not rescued from this obscurity out of love, he was recalled to service. When his mother, Agrippina, clawed her way back to the center of Roman power, she did so with breathtaking ruthlessness. A master strategist with an unquenchable thirst for influence, she seduced and married her own uncle, the aging Emperor Claudius. and in her hand she held her ultimate weapon, her handsome, artistically inclined son. She convinced Claudius to adopt the boy, renaming him Nero and placing him ahead of Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus, in the line of succession. Every step was a calculated move. For Agrippina, ambition was her religion, and her son was the Messiah she would place on the throne, whether he wanted it or not. The final step was the most direct. When Claudius had served his purpose, he was served a plate of poisoned mushrooms. Agrippina's son was now the Emperor of Rome. She had created an emperor. Now she would try to possess him. Here, history steps into a darker, more contested shadow, a realm of rumor and psychological horror recorded by the Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius. They wrote that Agrippina, fearing her influence over her teenage son was waning, offered him the one thing his other advisors could not. She offered him herself. Whether the act of incest was consummated or merely a pervasive rumor whispered in the halls of power is, in some ways, irrelevant. Its psychological impact was absolute. This was not an act of passion. It was the ultimate act of possession. Agrippina was attempting to forge a chain of shame and secrecy that would bind Nero to her forever. She had been the giver of his life and the architect of his power. Now she would attempt to become the object of his every desire, the center of his universe. She was building a psychological cage around the most powerful man in the world, lined with the velvet of a mother's love, but locked with the steel of sexual taboo. For a young man already grappling with the immense pressures of rule and the turbulent passions of youth, this maternal embrace was not one of comfort, but of suffocation. For a time, two other figures stood between Nero and the abyss, his tutors. The philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus were the opposing forces in Nero's life. They represented reason, moderation, and the Roman tradition of duty. They tried to channel Nero's passions into the arts, encouraging his love for music and poetry, hoping to shape him into a philosopher king, a ruler of culture and peace. They attempted to shield him from his mother's corrupting influence, creating a fragile equilibrium in the young emperor's court. They were, for a few celebrated years, successful. The first 5 years of Nero's reign were remembered as an era of stability and good governance, a golden age guided by the steady hands of his advisors. But the hollow space inside Nero was still there, and the lessons his mother taught him, that power is taken, not given, and that any obstacle can be removed with the right poison, had taken deeper root than any of Seneca's Stoic philosophies. The first true crack in the facade, the first glimpse of the monster beneath the artist, appeared at a dinner party. The guest of honor was his own stepbrother, Britannicus. At 14, Britannicus was becoming a man. His voice was breaking, and with it, he was gaining the support of those who saw him as the true heir of Claudius. He was a political threat. And for Nero, a threat was a problem that required a permanent solution. The assassination was a masterpiece of cold-blooded theater. In ancient Rome, a royal taster would test the food and drink for the emperor and his family. Britannicus's drink was served to him, tasted, and found to be safe. But it was deliberately served scalding hot. When Britannicus asked for cold water to cool it, the water he was given was laced with a fast-acting, deadly poison. The boy collapsed, convulsing, foaming at the mouth. The party descended into panic. Guests screamed, guards rushed forward. Only 2 people remained calm. Agrippina, who looked on with terror, realizing in that moment that her son was capable of a brutality that even she could not control. And Nero. The emperor leaned back, watching the scene with a chillingly detached curiosity. He casually remarked that the boy was likely just having one of his epileptic fits, and that he would recover shortly. He told the guests to remain seated and enjoy the feast. As his stepbrother's life ebbed away on the floor before him, Nero studied the mechanics of death, not as a grieving brother, but as a scientist observing an experiment. This was the true coronation of Nero the tyrant. It was his declaration of independence from his mother, a brutal message that he, and he alone, was now in control. He had learned her lesson all too well. The murder of Britannicus was not just the elimination of a rival. It was the murder of Nero's own remaining innocence. He had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The balancing act between Seneca's reason and Agrippina's corruption was over. The darkness had won. The boy who had been abandoned, who had been used as a pawn, who had been psychologically dominated by his own mother, had discovered the ultimate tool for controlling his world, the power of life and death. He was now free, but it was the terrifying freedom of a predator unleashed from its cage with an insatiable appetite and a complete absence of empathy. The embrace of Agrippina had not created a loyal son. It had created a monster who would, in time, turn and devour her too. Having a taste of absolute power, Nero found the presence of his mother Agrippina intolerable. She was a living monument to his own manufactured legitimacy, a constant nagging reminder that he had not seized the throne, but had been placed upon it. Her approval, which he had once craved, now felt like a judgment. Her advice, once the foundation of his rule, now sounded like a command. The suffocating embrace had become a stranglehold, and he was determined to break free. The murder of a mother, however, was a crime of a different magnitude than the poisoning of a stepbrother. Matricide was a sin against the gods and men, a stain so profound it could never be washed away. Nero's attempts to commit this ultimate transgression were a bizarre and horrifying blend of theatrical ingenuity and clumsy execution, revealing a mind that was both creative in its cruelty and deeply fearful of the act itself. His first attempt was a marvel of malevolent engineering. He commissioned the construction of a special collapsible boat. The plan was worthy of a Greek tragedy. He would invite Agrippina to a banquet at his seaside villa, feign a heartfelt reconciliation, and then send her home on this vessel of death. At a designated point in the journey, the canopy of her cabin, which had been weighted with lead, would collapse and crush her. As a backup, the ship itself was designed to break apart and sink. Everything went according to plan at first. The reconciliation was convincing. The farewell was affectionate. The ship sailed into the night. But the assassins had been too clever. The canopy mechanism deployed, but Agrippina's reinforced couch protected her from the full impact. As the boat began to disintegrate, chaos erupted. In the confusion, Agrippina's lady-in-waiting, Acerronia, made a fatal mistake. Thinking she could save herself by being mistaken for the Empress Dowager, she began to cry out, "I am Agrippina! Save the Emperor's mother!" The assassins, hearing her cries, descended upon her with their oars and clubs, beating her to death. In the darkness, the real Agrippina, wounded but alive, slipped quietly into the water and, with the silent determination that had defined her life, swam to shore. The news that she had survived sent Nero into a state of pure terror. His theatrical plot had failed, and he was now exposed. He knew his mother. She would not remain silent. She would rally her supporters, expose his incompetence, and turn the Senate against him. His fear curdled into rage. The time for subtlety was over. He abandoned all pretense of accident and turned to the bluntest of instruments, the sword. He dispatched his soldiers to her villa with a simple command. When they arrived, Agrippina faced them not with fear, but with a final, defiant act of psychological warfare. According to the historian Tacitus, she bared her abdomen and commanded the centurion, "Strike me in the womb." She was reminding him and her son of the very body that had given him life, forcing them to confront the true horror of their crime. It was her last act as a mother, and her last act of control. They killed her. The immediate aftermath of the matricide was not relief, but a crushing, paranoid guilt. Nero was haunted. He claimed to see his mother's ghost, to hear the whips and torches of the Furies sent from the underworld to torment him. He wandered his palace at night, a prisoner of the silence she had left behind. But this guilt did not lead to repentance. It led to a desperate need for distraction and justification. He had committed the ultimate sin. The only way to survive it was to convince himself that he was beyond sin altogether. He was no longer a mere man, bound by human morality. He had to become a god. This transformation began with the most audacious act of urban renewal in history. In 64 A.D., a great fire ravaged Rome, burning for over a week and consuming vast swathes of the city. The ancient rumor, immortalized in legend, is of Nero fiddling while Rome burned. The truth, as recorded by Tacitus, is more complex. Nero was at his villa in Antium when the fire broke out. He rushed back to the city, opened his private gardens to the homeless, and organized relief efforts. Yet the perception of his guilt clung to him, fueled by the staggering opportunism of what he did next. On the charred ruins of the city, on land that had once belonged to thousands of Roman citizens, he began construction of his new home, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. It was not a palace, it was a miniature world built for a single man. It sprawled across hundreds of acres, featuring an artificial lake, pastures with grazing animals, forests and vineyards. The palace itself was an architectural marvel of gold, ivory, and precious stones. Its centerpiece was a colossal bronze statue of himself, the Colossus of Nero, standing over 100 feet tall. The Golden House was a monument to his own ego, a declaration that the suffering of his people was merely an opportunity for his own glorification. He had not just rebuilt a section of Rome, he had consumed it. But a scapegoat was needed for the fire. Someone had to pay for the whispers that followed him through the streets. He found them in a small, misunderstood religious sect, the Christians. What followed was not a series of legal executions, but a public spectacle of sadism. Nero turned the persecution of the Christians into a form of grotesque entertainment for his court. He held lavish parties in his gardens where the main attraction was the torture of his victims. Some were crucified. Others were dressed in the skins of wild animals and torn apart by dogs. The most infamous of his methods was to use them as human torches. Covered in pitch, they were tied to stakes and set ablaze, their burning bodies providing the lighting for his evening festivities. This was the mind of a man desperate to project his own monstrous guilt onto others. By illuminating his garden with burning flesh, he was attempting to cast a light so bright it would banish the shadows of his own matricidal conscience. It was the birth of Nero the God King, a deity whose ceremonies were fueled by human suffering, and whose temple was built on the ashes of his own city. The chains that had bound him to his mother and to human morality were not just broken, they had been melted down and reforged into a crown. Freed from the psychological shackle of his mother, Nero's descent accelerated into a realm of depravity that was not merely about sensual indulgence, it was a calculated assault on the very foundations of Roman identity. His sexual rituals became a form of political theater, each act designed to shatter a different pillar of tradition, morality, and social order. He was no longer just breaking the rules. He was systematically dismantling the entire concept of rules, demonstrating to a horrified elite that he was the living embodiment of power, an entity to whom all things were permissible. The first and most sacred concept he chose to desecrate was that of virtus, the Roman ideal of manhood. Virtus was more than just courage in battle. It was a constellation of virtues encompassing duty, honor, and, critically, sexual dominance. A Roman man was defined by his active role. To willingly take the passive, receptive role was to be stripped of one's manhood, to become socially equivalent to a woman or a slave. Nero, in a move of breathtaking audacity, decided to publicly castrate himself of this ideal. He staged a formal wedding ceremony, not as the groom, but as the bride. The groom was another man, a member of his court named Pythagoras. This was not a private ceremony. It was a public spectacle, complete with a bridal veil, a dowry, and all the traditional rites. The Emperor of Rome, the commander of legions, and the Pontifex Maximus willingly and publicly assumed the role of a woman being married to one of his male subjects. The psychological shockwave this sent through the Roman aristocracy cannot be overstated. It was a calculated act of self-humiliation that, paradoxically, became an assertion of ultimate power. Nero was declaring that he was so far above the concepts of masculinity and femininity that he could switch between them at will. He was not a man, he was Nero. He was not bound by the identity that defined every other citizen of his empire. By debasing himself in the most profound way a Roman man could imagine, he was elevating himself to a status beyond human definition. It was a ritual, designed to prove that he had no equal, no opposite, and no peer. Having demolished the ideal of his own masculinity, he then turned his sights on the honor of the Roman elite. His instrument for this was his notoriously cruel praetorian prefect Tigellinus. Together, they orchestrated what the historian Tacitus described as one of the most infamous parties in history. It took place on the Lake of Agrippa, a massive artificial basin in the heart of Rome. A great raft was constructed, serving as a floating banquet hall, towed by other boats lavishly decorated in gold and ivory. But the main attraction was not the food or the music. It was the decorations that lined the shores of the lake. Tigellinus had ordered the construction of a series of floating brothels along the water's edge, and within them he had placed not common prostitutes but the women of the Roman aristocracy. Wives and daughters of senators and noblemen were forced to offer themselves to the party guests. Whether they were compelled by direct threats or by the crippling fear of displeasing the emperor is a matter of historical debate, but the result was the same. The most powerful women in Rome were reduced to sexual commodities for public consumption. Nero himself, of course, was the star of this debauched festival. He drifted from brothel to brothel, publicly indulging in every form of sexual activity, ensuring that his own degradation of the nobility was witnessed by all. This was not a party, it was a ritual of mass humiliation. Nero was systematically stripping the elite of their honor, forcing them to watch as their wives and daughters were defiled. It was a brutal message. Your status, your lineage, your family honor, none of it matters. Only my pleasure matters. You are nothing more than props in the theater of my desires. Yet, even in this whirlwind of calculated depravity, a single, raw nerve of human emotion remained. His obsessive guilt over the death of his wife, Poppaea. He had killed her in a moment of brute, impulsive violence, kicking her while she was pregnant. It was a sloppy, ugly act, lacking the theatrical flair he so admired. The loss, or perhaps the loss of the control she represented, haunted him. This guilt would fuel the most bizarre and psychologically revealing of all his rituals, his relationship with the boy Sporus. After Poppaea's death, Nero was consumed by a desperate, frantic grief. It was during this period that he encountered Sporus, a young freedman of the court who bore an uncanny resemblance to the dead empress. For Nero's fractured mind, this was a sign, an opportunity not just to find a substitute, but to achieve a form of resurrection. He commanded his surgeons to perform the most extreme act of transformation possible. Sporus was to be castrated. He was not to be made a eunuch in the traditional sense. He was to be surgically erased as a man, hollowed out so that he could be filled with the ghost of Poppaea. The public wedding that followed, which so shocked Rome, can now be seen in its true, pathetic light. It was the grand finale of Nero's psychological disintegration. The ceremony was not a celebration of a new love, but a desperate attempt to rewrite the past. By dressing Sporus in Poppaea's clothes, by calling him her name, by forcing the world to recognize him as her, Nero was trying to physically manifest his own delusion. He was attempting to undo his murder by creating a living effigy of his victim. It was the ultimate act of a solipsist, a man whose internal reality had become so powerful that he believed he could impose it on the external world through sheer force of will. In this one grotesque ritual, all the threads of Nero's madness converged: his fluid disregard for gender, his need for theatrical displays of power, his capacity for cruelty, and his desperate, all-consuming guilt. The boy Sporus became the ultimate symbol of Nero's reign. A human being turned into a beautiful, empty vessel, a living testament to an emperor who had the power to create anything he wanted, except for a reason to live. The empire, however, was not a stage, and its people were not merely actors in Nero's private psychodrama. The grotesque theater that he had constructed in Rome was financed by the systematic plunder of the provinces. While he was building his golden house and staging his perverse weddings, the legions on the frontiers were growing restless, and the governors in distant lands were watching the decay at the center with a mixture of contempt and ambition. The elaborate rituals of power could not hide a simple truth. The emperor was unstable, the treasury was being drained for his absurd projects, and the foundations of the Roman state were cracking. The end, when it came, was not a grand tragedy, but a pathetic collapse. Revolts erupted, first in Gaul, then in Spain. The governor Galba, a stern and respected veteran, was declared emperor by his troops. The Praetorian Guard in Rome, the very men who had once saluted a castrated boy as their empress, were bribed to abandon their master. The Senate, which had endured years of humiliation, finally found its courage. They declared Nero an enemy of the state, a hostis publicus, sentencing him to be beaten to death in public. The God King, the divine artist, suddenly found himself a hunted fugitive. His final hours were a portrait of abject cowardice. He fled Rome in disguise, hiding in a freedman's villa on the outskirts of the city. He, who had commanded the deaths of thousands with a casual wave of his hand, could not bring himself to perform the final act. He paced, he wept, he lamented his fate. He ordered his own grave to be dug, all the while bemoaning the loss that the world was about to suffer. As the sound of approaching horsemen grew louder, he placed a dagger to his throat, but his hand trembled. He had to beg his personal secretary to guide his hand and deliver the fatal thrust. His final words, uttered as his life bled out, were not those of a repentant tyrant or a failed emperor. They were the ultimate expression of his lifelong delusion. Qualis artifex perio. What an artist dies in me. In that one sentence, the entire tragedy of his life is laid bare. Even at the moment of his squalid, terrified death, he did not see himself as a monster. He did not see the ghosts of his mother, his wife, his stepbrother, or the countless Christians he had tortured. He saw himself as a misunderstood genius, a poet and a singer whose art the world was too brutish to appreciate. His greatest crime, in his own mind, was not the murders or the depravity, but the failure of his audience to give him the applause he so desperately craved. The Golden House was his masterpiece. The suffering of others was his stagecraft, and his entire reign had been his one and only performance. The death of the artist did not bring peace. It unleashed chaos. The year that followed, 69 A.D., is known as the Year of the Four Emperors, a bloody civil war that tore the empire apart. Nero's legacy was a power vacuum, a stark demonstration that the stability of the entire world had rested on the whims of a deeply broken man. He became, for all of Western history, the archetypal tyrant, a caricature of decadent cruelty. But to dismiss him as a simple monster is to miss the more terrifying lesson of his reign. The story of Nero is not just a lurid chapter from ancient Rome. It is a profound case study in how absolute power, when given to a fragile and wounded psyche, does not merely corrupt, it metastasizes. It turns personal insecurity into public persecution, private guilt into theatrical cruelty, and a desperate need for love into a demand for total submission. The monster that was Nero was not born in a vacuum. He was created. He was forged in the crucible of a violent dynasty, shaped by the manipulative ambitions of his mother, and finally unleashed by a system that granted one man the power to remake the world in the image of his own madness. His grotesque sexual rituals were not the cause of his tyranny. They were the symptoms. They were the desperate, frantic attempts of a hollow man to feel something, to assert an identity, to fill the void inside himself with the shock and awe of others. He is a timeless warning that the most dangerous men are not those who crave power for its own sake, but those who seek it to heal their own brokenness. The palaces and statues of Nero have long since turned to dust, but the questions his reign poses are eternal. How thin is the line between a leader and a performer? And what happens when a society, desperate for stability or entertainment, willingly hands a godlike power to a man who is, at his core, just a terrified child screaming for attention?